Thank you so much, Rochelle. It is a pleasure to be here at NFT Fest. I'm Chloe White. I'm the Managing Director of Genesis Block, a crypto regulation advisory firm in Australia. I'm joined today by Joni Provich and Michael Bacina, who I feel need no introduction, but for people who might be new, so Joni is the special counsel at Mills Oakley and Mike is a partner at Piper Alderman. Joni and Mike both wear many, many hats and are involved in so many things. They are both huge advocates of the blockchain industry, active participants in policy reform, and do a lot of work in blockchain education and many other things. So go and find Joni and Mike on Twitter and LinkedIn right now. Give them a follow, see what they're all about. But I want to start this legal and regulatory session at NFT Fest with a confession. When I had the idea to start a crypto regulation advisory business, I really did not expect NFTs to emerge as such a prominent theme of my work. And for many of the use cases of NFTs that we've heard about through the course of the day today, art and gaming being some examples, these are not sectors of the economy, arts and entertainment that we tend to think about as being heavily regulated or legally risky. So a fair opening question for our session today might be, why is there a legal panel at NFT Fest? So I want to ask Mike and Joni today, first of all, what legal issues are you seeing in your work in relation to NFTs? Mike, let's start with you.
Thanks so much, Chloe, for having us, and thanks for everyone who's worked so hard behind the scenes to make this event so successful. I assume you can hear me okay, right? Excellent. NFTs have had me feeling like I felt back in the early days of Ethereum and the rise of ICOs and all these really exciting smart contract developments coming out. The Cambrian growth of everything going on is amazing, and the legal issues coming out of it are super fascinating to lawyers and probably really boring to everyone else. But we're seeing this, I essentially describe it as a product because it gives rise to so many interesting issues that, you know, at a simple end, art-based NFT can look like a print you might buy in a shop of an artist that you like, except it's purely digital and has all these amazing abilities to move around. But other issues come out of it with more complicated products, as you've heard from other speakers as well. So I'm seeing effectively a brand new product that we have to figure out how to deal with all of the contractual issues. And I certainly do not envy the people like Joni who have the tax brains who can figure out the taxation issues around them as well.
Well, I'm still figuring out the tax issues too, don't worry. But I mean, it's so broad, and you know, 2 years ago it was all the DeFi and the Compound and the MakerDAO, and my big question around those and the taxpayers that I was advising was, you know, are these stability fees or fees when you pay back your vault subject to interest withholding tax? And then you look into the domestic rules and double tax treaties, and you really can't get a sense of whether it actually applies when there are technology contracts looking after the interest calculation mechanics, and you try and trace through which wallet address is held by which centralized entity. So that same sort of analysis is rearing its head now with royalty withholding tax attached to sort of commissions and trailing commissions associated with NFTs. But tax doesn't, it's not the only issue. There are a number of regulatory and commercial issues. And one really fun example we had was a uni student who is studying law and had a very valuable NFT and wanted to fractionalize it through fractional. So in goodwill, this person came to us and said, what do I need to do? Do I need to be licensed to just engage with this fractional platform? And my regulatory native, Mark Bland, we went back and forth to try and understand how the laws apply. And the laws get us 80% there, but with the 80-20 rule, that last 20% is just hard work. So that's why we do so much policy work to try and bridge the gap and actually make those issues understandable to policymakers.
It sounds like there are quite a few legal issues in the areas of crypto that we tend to associate with regulatory risk that are also creeping into the NFT space. So a few different things that we've talked about there. Maybe taking a step back for a moment, we did have a question come through on Twitter. How is an NFT described in legal terms? Joni, sticking with you for a moment, what's your view on that?
There is no legal definition that's agreed and accepted upon. I mean, I think I heard yesterday that the ISO, the International Standards Organization, did actually release their standard on terminology. So I'm yet to read that and to actually see if non-fungible token makes an appearance there, but that's where I would start. but it's when I'm using it to talk to, sorry, that is my baby in the background. COVID, apologies. But you've got not just fungible versus non-fungible now, you've got this middle category of semi-fungible. And I actually find myself in the area of describing what is truly non-fungible versus what's semi-fungible. And this ERC 1155 is right smack bang in that discussion there. So I actually explain it by reference to what the technology factually is trying to do. And that's my foundation for understanding what the hell is going on with the legal and tax side.
Mike, what's your take on this?
At a simple level, most art-associated NFTs that are sold without any kinds of terms and conditions, in my view, which a court may or may not agree with, they look like a digital print, like a print you buy in a shop. I'll be very surprised if we ever end up with a lawsuit that comes down with a different finding as to what that is, because you're buying a piece of art that happens to have the ownership recorded digitally on a blockchain. That doesn't seem to be terribly difficult. The really interesting edge cases for lawyers comes about from these kinds of products that Joni mentioned before, where you have opportunities for sharing secondary sale revenue or primary sale revenue in ways that the law generally dealing with movies and very large licensing deals and things where there was enough money to warrant doing custom setup for everything. Whereas blockchain itself, as it always has, enables much smaller payments, approaching micropayment level stuff, and moves them around really, really easily. So you have this issue where the law might get 80% there on certain parts, but that missing 20% doesn't get you there doing it the traditional way, because they were designed for systems where it was a film, where there might be $100,000 of royalties, and it matters to withhold tax on that kind of sum of money, whereas the withholding on a $2.50 share of a automatically paid secondary transaction fee is something that the law never really designed to encompass. And so we don't know from a policy perspective if the government's attitude is, this is all too small to worry about, or hang on a minute, this could change hands so many times in the course of a few weeks that actually it becomes real money. So that's fascinating. We are seeing a rush of rights holders to this space. I probably, like Joni, barely sleep in the last couple of months with the number of things going on, and it feels so exciting. And lawyers were used to just dealing with boring contracts and stuff, but now we're actually getting to do cool things with household name artists and video games and things that everybody's coming into the space. So there is a rush of lawyers, and we're so lucky to be already connected with a bunch of lawyers who've grown up in blockchain land around the world, who are all also putting their heads together on matters. So even working on these deals where we're figuring out how these traditional big name artists are going to be putting out releases, they can't do it in the traditional way they would run their license. So a major legal issue is licensing that you'll see from one point. Bored Apes, great example, barely anything in terms of terms and conditions, and what is there with respect is contradictory and doesn't work, over to NBA Top Shots from Dapper Labs that is gigantic American style drafting, 25 pages or so of very, very, very comprehensive terms and conditions and licensing that no one will ever read. At least on the Bored Ape side, there's a good chance someone will read them. And I sort of look at CryptoKitties in the middle that had a license, the Nifty license from years ago when CryptoKitties was launched, that is a pretty sensible license. But I think the starting point for attendees and those who care about buying NFTs is to figure out what it is that they are buying, because that is the number one and most important thing to know. Are they buying something in a centralized platform, in which case they're reliant on that centralized body staying there, and they likely have a contractual relationship directly with a company or some kind of entity that they could enforce or they could complain about? Or are they buying something that's more akin to a Bored Ape or a really decentralized NFT with very little in the way of terms and conditions, in which case they're going to need to think about it more like a digital print? There's interesting spin-offs with enforcement. I'm seeing Just last night at 11:30, I had a client call me and say, oh my gosh, someone's ripping off some NFTs I've put out as a fairly successful product. So we've been trying to deal with that and address it. So you've got these fascinating legal issues coming out. And in that case, it's very difficult to figure out who it is who's doing the knockoffs and try and sort of push them out or point out that they have no right to produce these knockoffs and try and sell them. We're seeing a very fast rise of scams in the space. There's been a lot of chatter about airdropped scam NFTs showing up in people's wallets. So from the legal side, I would, other tech people would also warn if an NFT shows up in your wallet and you don't know what it is, don't click on it, because there's some weird hostile payloads going around that go to how some of these smart contracts underlying NFTs are based. But I'm really hopeful. I'll bet your lunch, Joni, there won't be anything in the standards that'll be helpful for the current NFT challenges we're facing, because they take so long to get written. We might get some in a few years. Similarly, I'm hopeful we'll have some stuff in the Bragg inquiry report about NFTs, because they have the time to get it out because they've got another month. And I know that the senator was on earlier today, and his speech is also up on his website now, and it's one of the most supportive speeches I've ever seen from a politician in relation to cryptocurrency or NFT space, which is fantastic.
That is right. I had a look at the senator's statement myself, and I am so excited to see what he comes out with his recommendations next month. I suppose, Mike, you've raised a very important warning there about scams, and a good reminder to everyone that if you see an unusual asset in your wallet, it may be a scam. So be very careful how you interact with those. And I have heard a number of stories of that in my own network. You also spoke a lot, Mike, about terms and conditions and some traditional systems as well. And we've spoken a little bit on the regulatory risks associated with these products. One thing that I am wondering is, how can we think about NFTs also as a legal tool, or as something that also provides solutions? I remember years ago seeing a lot of ads to buy a star, and you essentially are getting this piece of paper that says that you own a star at a particular location. As far as I understand, I don't think it is actually really possible to own something outside of Earth's orbit beyond, our kind of own our own little planet here. But is this something that NFTs are actually a solution for? If I buy a certificate that says that I own a star, I actually have no way of verifying in that centralized system whether they've sold the same star to many other people. And there have been some questions that have come through in advance on, how do we differentiate between when is an NFT an asset in its own right, rather than a certificate of ownership or another tangible or intangible asset? So in the NFT space, I've seen one influencer on Twitter who has undertaken an experiment with a smashed diamond. So she bought a diamond, minted an NFT of it, and then intentionally set out to destroy the underlying asset to determine what was the actual value of the NFT itself, separate to the value of the diamond. So we come up against these issues of, if we can identify what actually an NFT is and how ownership of an NFT actually incurs value in legal terms, we can sort of also think about NFTs as providing solutions to issues of legal ownership and property. So I'm really interested in your views on how do we think about this separation between ownership and issues and values relating to the token itself versus something that might be associated with the token.
I'll make some initial comments here. So NFTs are no different to the other fungible digital assets as well, that we have a real hard time as lawyers proving that ownership, and particularly exclusive ownership if you've shared the private keys. So and the centralized exchanges, let alone the decentralized exchanges, are still not mature enough to help people, businesses, funds document the legal ownership of their various digital assets, including NFTs, or their involvement with various of these digital asset schemes. So whilst I love decentralization, I am committed to that cause. I really believe in it. There's still the role of lawyers to have the paper documents over here and documenting, for the avoidance of doubt, that Joni Provich at this Ethereum wallet address owns XYZ fungible tokens and ABC NFTs. And that is my legal record of saying I own them in my own right, or I own them in my fund. so that if anybody does take over control of my wallet address, or I'm somehow hacked, or you think of the scenario, we still unfortunately have to resort to these paper document and proofs. And, on the regulatory side, especially the tax reviews and assurances that we're needing to provide on that front, having the real-time contemporaneous record keeping of what you're doing and what you own is still it's still needed, despite how we might be able to feel like we're in control of our own assets in our own wallets.
And I'll only add to that. I think there's an interesting conceptual challenge, because a lot of people rush with the excitement and awesome things you can do with blockchain and tokenized things to move perhaps to a point we might get to one day. But having a NFT recognized in its own right is kind of like saying, well, why don't we recognize bearer shares in their own right? The piece of paper is the most powerful piece of technology we've ever invented, because we can write something on it that says I own a thing, and that piece of paper is the ownership of that thing. And it's awesome. It's totally decentralized and peer-to-peer. I don't have to deal with any intermediaries. I can go sell that piece of paper to Joni and she can give it me cash. And we can do an atomic swap over a desk. So there's all these really exciting things that are done on blockchains that can be done digitally that once upon a time were always done in person. But the law looks to analogies and trying to ensure that we operate consistently so that people will be able to plan and run businesses and run their lives with certainty around that. And so I think that it's not quite accurate to look at how NFTs could be considered to be a blended single standing asset of itself. It doesn't need to be, because an NFT for art, which contains in the metadata a link to an IPFS of the art, is for all intents and purposes the same as a digital print, as a print that we'd hang on the wall if it was physical, because it contains everything that is needed to move it around. As Joni alluded to, you still may need a contract for sale if you're going to move it to protect you for sale. You might have a smart contract that can deal with that in an escrow manner. That's a different thing. But NFTs provide wonderful title to whatever they're linked to. But I'm seeing in a lot of projects, I should have noted before, there's a division emerging where you're seeing people looking to use things like IPFS and permanent storage solutions to create as standalone as possible NFT asset, which has benefits because it's a, not your metadata, not your NFT kind of idea. And then you have more traditional folk coming in who are rights holders who want to protect the usage of NFTs. So they will be linking into stored media and creating a problem for themselves because they've just sold someone something that they effectively are going to need to maintain storage for forever. However, they fixed the problem that if someone wishes to use that NFT in connection with, hate crimes or something really awful, they can cut it off. And for hardcore blockchain maxis, that's a nightmare scenario. Oh my gosh, it's not my asset, it's not my thing. And there's a bit of a divide emerging there where the maxi approach, which is also sensible and has merit, to say it's just like a trading card. Why should the people who make Pokemon get to come in and take my Pokemon cards out of my room if they don't like what I'm doing with them, versus relying on what's the best analogy there? The Nintendo shop to maintain my access to the Nintendo games that I or my children bought. Definitely my children, not me, to play all the time. I just test them to make sure they're working. So there's that kind of realm. So there's an interesting divide, and Yatsu had some interesting comments around that and saying, there's a risk of digital colonialism, but I'm not sure it's an all or nothing situation, because there are people who want that very standalone form of ownership. And that's the one where it's very hard for the rights holders to do anything once it's issued. And you're seeing a lot of the 10,000 collection projects issuing things on that basis. Even CryptoKitties says in their license, you can do whatever you like with the CryptoKitty, but if you make more than $100,000 a year, with your CryptoKitties by something, t-shirt sales, we'd really appreciate you come and talk to us and maybe give us a cut. Versus you can't do anything with this other than use it and display it online, and very, very restrictive. Sometimes say in NBA Top Shots only have the display with their software. So we're going to see multiple products. We're going to see a battle of what the market wants. Like you, Chloe, I'm economically trained in my undergrad. I think that convenience wins. So I think an awful lot of metaverse stuff may exist in some ways, but we're probably going to see very centralized metaverse, very centralized NFT projects be very successful because it's going to let people in a way they're familiar with. They'll be able to do it in a more traditional legal packaging, and that will be very straightforward. And then you're going to see these more experimental ones that over time may very well take over. We don't know yet. and it'll take longer than the maxis want it to be if that happens, and it'll scare the hell out of the people who are used to the centralized stuff. But then you have these edge case ones, and the maxi ones are a little where we're giving you real clear ownership. That's where you get into other issues about that revenue sharing and stuff that's totally alien, and getting into really interesting questions of decentralization that haven't even been answered in relation to DeFi products, as Joni said earlier. So they're not likely to be answered in relation to NFTs anytime soon. Things like borrowing against NFTs and fractionalizing them, because they just won't fit the legal frameworks we have. And as great as the Bragg inquiry is, there's no way they're putting out a recommendation on should fractionalized NFTs be allowed. Well, we could write to them and see if they could squeeze it in the report, but I can't imagine they'll actually find a way to get it in there.
Well, and to just say one thing before we move off this topic, Chloe, it's not all bad news. I don't think we'll be in paper forever, but I think what we need is proper digital identity systems, because once we have digital identity and we can link our ownership of our digital assets to that digital identity, that proves ownership, and immutably so, and in a secure fashion that we have come to know and trust in what blockchain technology gives us. So digital identity is hard, and governments around the world are working on it, and that's where I really want to see things going, so that I don't have to be doing these paper documents anymore. And I am working with an incredible man called Peter Powles on digital identity and zero knowledge KYC, to have privacy enhancing technology around our ownership and our engagement with digital assets and with decentralized technology. So check out his work.
Okay, so in conclusion, it sounds like NFTs may not be the be all and end all of ownership in a legal sense, but it sounds like depending on the way that some of these are structured and implemented, it could be quite interesting to see how it evolves in the future. There was a little bit of a hint in your last statement, Joni, around this connection between the blockchain world and the real world. Digital identity is a really good example of that challenge. And for some NFTs, they may face that same challenge as well. And one of the questions that's come through has been, if you have two NFTs on two separate blockchains that lay claim to the same one real tangible asset, how would the law determine which is valid? And I'm seeing in the chat on this Zoom call, there's been a few people who've asked for some commentary on copyright as well. Copyright infringement laws, would they result in an NFT owner being sued? Are you seeing this happen already? How big of an issue is this in the space?
I'm about to go sue someone as soon as I can identify them for ripping off one of my clients' products. So the short answer is it's all coming, because it's been Cambrian explosion. And that those people will go down because they've left their traces of their transactions into digital currency exchanges that we know. So the traceability of blockchain makes it awful for money laundering to start with, but those kinds of disputes are coming up. To jump on their specific question is, the law would look at where the underlying rights came from. So if it's one of 10,000 collection, and you had a clear person or company which issued that collection, and somebody else issued it on another blockchain as a secondary NFT, then you just need the evidence of, well, who had the rights to the art in the first place. So if a project is looking to do a 10,000 NFT drop, they're going to need to have intellectual property assignment or licensing agreements with their artists, or if they're employees, make sure it's covered off in their employment or contractor agreements, so they have proof of title going through, so they can sell that as part of their 10,000 collection. And that's what the courts would look to if you had a fight. And that's a fight if the other person on the other blockchain said, no, I own this. And then it could come down to something as prosaic as, has the artist gone and sold their works to somebody else simultaneously, in which case the artist is going to end up getting sued for not doing an exclusive deal. So there's a whole lot of tiny little annoying pitfalls that people can fall into when they're setting up these projects, which is those little things that lawyers save them from when we come in and do these documents that no one wants to read. And everyone goes, oh God, it's so boring. And it's boring, but it's really important, because things can turn on a couple of words in lawsuits if they need to. And there's really huge money flowing around the space. So disputes are coming already. As I mentioned, there's people already trying to do knockoffs. The Banksy one was really interesting, even though it had a happy ending, with Pranksy buying what he thought at the time could be a Banksy NFT, but it turned out Banksy's own website had been the subject of a small security breach, posting an image which then went up on OpenSea and sold for I think it was 100 ETH, but then the 100 ETH was returned in classic crypto style when someone takes it all because they kind of just teaching someone a lesson. But even that, everyone got all excited as I did, like, wow, did Banksy just drop a secret NFT? And you just don't know. So you have this provenance of title, which ironically blockchain can help with the underlying artists as well, if that's set up from the start. But what I'm seeing in most projects is they're not trying to blockchain all the way down the line. If they're a centralized issuer, they're getting their agreements in place, making sure their licensing is right up to the point of sale, having a license that comes through to the holder of the NFT that they can continue to enjoy over time. So it is kind of coming together and working, and it'll settle down, we hope, in the next few months. Maybe some standards will emerge. That's what we hope was going to happen with, I think, the Nifty license for CryptoKitties. So, I have said to Joni, once we manage to find some time to sleep and whatnot, maybe we can have a crack at an updated CryptoKitties one and give it back to them, because that's an open source license. But I haven't seen that deployed on many projects.
Joni, do you have a list of people you're suing?
Well, I with the suing point, I think infringement is a bit in the eye of the beholder at the moment, because again, I go back to DeFi, and everybody would know about the Uniswap SushiSwap debacle, and but we're dealing with open source code. So SushiSwap copied the code, executed the vampire attack, and pulled liquidity. And maybe that was bad for Uniswap for a little while, but it was overall kind of good for the community and learning. And I mean, people will probably have very different views on that, so hit me with it. But I sort of take that view as well in it being in the eye of the beholder. And in one sense, an artist that suffers some other party copying whatever digital content they've created and linked to their NFT is not on. We never want to be supporting intentional harm or unintentional harm. We want people to be taking reasonable measures to be going about their business and their personal hobbies and enjoyment safely and for the good of the world. So, but we're still learning as well. And the practical example is, I've minted my own NFTs on OpenSea, and it gives me all of the options of what kind of levels of metadata I want to create. And that's fun. But what it doesn't do is give me any click options of what legal rights I want to be creating with my NFTs. And it's just a few, maybe 2 or 3 extra click boxes. So come on, give the lawyers a leg up and help us educate the rest of the community, because everybody says, do your own research, but where do we start doing our own research? And I think it's in these interfaces. And one thing that we don't want to bring in from legacy world of centralized entities or CeFi is these long disclaimer documents and terms and conditions that nobody reads. And you do only generally go back to them when you need to enforce your rights. And hey, they're not in your favor to begin with, really. So I'm all for cleaner and simpler interfaces that people can actually engage with, so that we understand what's going on, and whether we do want to enforce our rights or just let things go up to a certain point, or whether you really want to benefit from the ongoing commercialization of this. And then finally, I would just say I work heavily with my IP expert, James Lawrence, and he's done some incredible work of late with DAOs. For all of the core contributors to this particular DAO, they've had to sign a covenant that the IP is owned by the DAO. So this is breathing new life into how we think about what entities can own property. And there was a separate case on AI, that an AI-generated works was able to be patented in the name of the AI rather than the developer that coded that program. So we just have to think differently, and it's still a little bit in the eye of the beholder, and what is benefiting all of us by way of learning and getting to ultimately good policy in the end.
Joni, I'm glad that you mentioned DAOs, because they're getting quite a few mentions in the chat and a bit on Twitter as well. And I can only imagine that for lawyers in this space, it must be such a giant headache when we compound these new different areas of blockchain or crypto innovation, and then mesh them together. So if we think a little bit about, these copyright issues that we've been talking about, one person in the chat has asked, what if a DAO develops a generative NFT artwork? How would you work through these issues in the case of something like that?
Well, you'd probably first of all have to work out what the legal standing of a DAO is, which Joni and I regularly discuss, and that's a big sticking point. We've got, I think, as someone just mentioned in the chat before, Wyoming has legal recognition of a DAO structure. So there's an interesting move to DAOs perhaps being recognized as a form of legal organization. At the moment, probably looking like an unincorporated association or a partnership. If it went before a court, we suspect that will be what the court would shoehorn it into, which none of the participants in the DAO would be happy with because of the unlimited liability that attaches to them all by being associated with it. So really, legal recognition of DAOs is more about limiting the liability of participants in recognized ways and giving it that legal personality. Because you always go back to the base principles that companies only exist because Parliament made them into legal fictions in order to create economic incentives. So we can organize however we like. I can make a club with my friends and build a little clubhouse in the bush and put a little sign out the front, but that doesn't mean I've created a legal entity. It means I might have a club of people and we might jointly do things, but we're all responsible for what we're jointly doing. And that's an interesting clash that runs into some of the philosophy and super libertarian philosophy around some crypto aspects of, no, it's caveat emptor stuff. I will add to what Joni said before, a lot of smart contracts have your open source license at the front. So notwithstanding that people don't read terms and conditions, a lot of the open source stuff does cover that off so that it is totally legit to take. My comments were really focused on that art aspect, which Joni and I heartily say, do not steal people's stuff or be cheeky about it. And I have seen some hilarious messages, like someone messaging someone from saying, hey, I own this CryptoPunk on Solana. Stop using it as your Twitter profile. It's like, well, what are you going to do?
But also, so I loved what Uniswap did with their version 3, because they adjusted that license and they said any commercial CeFi institution wanting to benefit from our technology, and in the background, we all know that banks and, I'll call them traditional fintechs, although that's an oxymoron, are all trying to race ahead on their own CeFi DeFi bridges. They're finally waking up to the efficiency and the beauty of this technology. Yes, there are risks and we all know them well, but they are waking up to that. And I love that Uniswap has now said, hey, CeFi, if you want to benefit from our technology, you will have to pay fees for that. And that benefits the treasury and then ultimately the community of Uniswap. So I love this sense. I think it was the earlier presenter that talked about universal basic equity. And I mean, coming from the concepts of universal basic income and each people having the ability to access things that they can afford and enjoy their life and overall make them have a better sense of well-being are all to be applauded. So that's everything about decentralization and open source, which I think should be supported. And if you look to the fine print of that NFT code, that's where you'll see the license detail.
I thought we didn't want boring long terms and conditions, though.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for the lawyers in the room,
exactly. We're never going to get away from T's and C's is the ultimate problem. But we might get to some standards where people can say, this uses a, the Mike and Joni license or something, or a GPL license that people can then take the time to read a summary of and understand simply. Like, I love the CryptoKitties Nifty license. It's got a summary that is actually correct of what the license is. So you can read it in plain English in like 3 or 4 paragraphs and then look at the really detailed license if you really want to get into that and nerd out, which I of course have. But that's an interesting place that it's going, because you've got this explosion of popularity. But it's the same as video games. People play video games or download them, and there's a whole bunch of licensing that goes with it. Same with all the software on our computer. We've kind of got comfortable with not reading a lot of the T's and C's and relying on consumer protection law. Someone put a comment about, what happens to DAO code when there's unfairness or unconscionability, and that goes to the heart of the DAO problem of the liability and enforcement. Code as law doesn't work and isn't recognized by the courts. So I've many years have argued with people who say no code is law around DAOs. It's just practically it might be very difficult to enforce rather than at law. If you put that in front of a judge, watch how fast they throw it away and say, nah, You as an organizer have probably contributed to something, and therefore you have some responsibility in it. And then we'll get some weird law made out of that when some cases come out, because you'll have people arguing for a specific outcome that may not serve the community well. But going towards those agreed standards, which lawyers can help craft, hopefully, and save time and money by using agreed standards and try and make the Lego blocks of law in certain pieces. That's what we probably work towards to try and solve some of these IP issues and whatnot. And then in the meantime, there's a whole lot of caveat emptor. There's questions you have to be careful and ask when you're getting involved. I've managed to quickly cobble together a quick half dozen questions which creators or buyers or issuers would want to ask in connection with being involved in NFTs. So I'll send that to the organizers to share around, and I'll chuck it up on my LinkedIn and Twitter after this presentation. And that's just some starting points for people who are starting out to say, what's a little checklist of what should I look into to make sure that I'm going to try and avoid the major problems. And hopefully that's a little bit of help to people.
Thanks, Mike. There have been a number of questions in the chat of where people can go and look at different resources. So I think people will be very keen to see that. I personally would love to have a look at it. And you also answered a question that we had from Rory earlier, who has been asking so many fantastic questions today. And even though we are coming to time, I'm desperate to find out the answer to a question that he asked earlier today, which is that if I buy an NFT through my super fund, does that mean I cannot use that, say it's a CryptoPunk as my profile picture, because I would actually be gaining some other enjoyment from the asset?
Yeah, I wouldn't be using it on your Twitter profile.
It's a good straightforward answer to that question there from the lawyers. Okay, so a final question then before we wrap up. Mike, I know you and I discussed years ago, I'm something of an NFT OG, having pioneered crypto wallabies, in the past. When we think about the way that the NFT space looks today and where it might be going in the future, there's been a clear theme emerge from our discussion around the need for standards, or maybe even some kind of licensing. If you are an individual or a company who's wanting to be inspired by my crypto wallabies and, launch or mint some kind of NFT, like as Joni has done as well, and you know that there is all of this legal uncertainty and regulatory risk, all these different issues that we've spoken about, and this has been such a dense conversation with so much interesting information. How would you even start thinking about how to go about that in a way that minimizes your regulatory risk? So I'd love to hear from each of you what your advice is to those people. Where should they start, and what should they be thinking about? Who should they be going to for help?
Joni, you can go first.
I think just start having fun. Like, do it with small, $50 or a couple of $100. Just do it for fun first. And if you're really worried, buy a whole new laptop to do it on, and don't do anything else on that laptop. If you can't get your head around all of the cybersecurity risks and you don't want to put your existing devices at risk, buy a new laptop, start little, start fresh, and maybe that's your crypto gaming laptop in the end. So if you're doing any of these play to earn kind of things, you'll probably make the investment back in a year or maybe less.
I agree with Joni. I think if you're at the buyer end, you learn how to use MetaMask, you get in, you have a play with it. I've probably personally held the hands of 12 of my friends in getting MetaMask installed for them to buy their first NFTs. NFTs are an amazing shift from crypto being for those who love to use crypto to try and buy and trade it, and all the people saying, what's the use of it, to suddenly need to use it to get into a lot of NFT projects. So that's really cool. And the OpenSea app on iPhone that came out the other week is just the best UX of any blockchain interface that's super decentralized that I've ever seen, pretty much. Like the MetaMask authorization works well. Otherwise, Chloe, that felt very much like who should people come and talk to? Ask the lawyers if they should use our services. Yes, please come and use our services. But there's heaps of resources online. I think that when I always say to people, if you're at the creator end and you're looking to give people something that starts to look like passive income, red flags should start going off. If you're designing a project, that's when you're going to need to be talking to lawyers anyway about terms and conditions and contracts and whatnot. If you're issuing stuff, or you're an artist and you want to sell things, unless you're happy to give away all sorts of rights. The buyer end is a lot easier. I think you can get into that pretty easily and just have a bit of a punt and have a bit of fun. It's at the creator end is also relatively easy if you don't mind getting a little burned or losing the value of your art that you're giving out there. It's at the issuer end, if you're making and selling these things as a primary issue or running a marketplace wanting to help break in there, that you're going to run into a lot more legal issues quickly. And that's when you're really going to need lawyers to do that. So probably don't need lawyers if you're a buyer. You probably need a little bit of legal help if you're a creator or artist, and you probably need the most if you're in that issuer space. So hopefully, I won't go through all the questions now, but I'll shoot them up shortly after this because we're way over time. But otherwise, many of the questions I've posted there, people can sort of ask, and hopefully that'll help them on their journey as well.
That is a fantastic summary of what to look out for. This has been a really fun discussion. I want to thank everyone for their participation in the chat, which has been super active as well. As I said, please look at Mike and Joni's profiles online, reach out to them if you need any legal advice, and feel free to reach out to me on any of those channels as well if you have more questions. And I will hand back to Rochelle.